Hello, everyone. I'm hoping that now is when I'm supposed to be talking. It's 11 a.m. Hopefully you're here for using Zappa to pretend that you know how to do serverless things. I'm Genghis Philip. I'm an engineering manager over at Rebel Health, but most of that doesn't matter. What you need to know about me is I'm not a developer. I've learned to code in like maybe the past year, and it's usually just hacking together Python. I think one of the most important things that I've learned in doing a little bit of code here and there is that it can be extremely useful, and oftentimes where you hit a block is not, hey, I know how to write a thing that makes Python give me a list of numbers or names. It's how do I make this useful again and again and again. My experience very recently, in the past, again, year, has been trying to pull data out of Jira, which I'm sure is making everyone in the room roll their eyes, in order to do averages and figure out velocities over time and backlog health and a bunch of really bureaucratic stuff. But it's stuff that we're copying out of Jira into a spreadsheet like once or twice a week, which is bonkers. So we tried to program Jira to do a bunch of dashboards and stuff, and that's okay. But when we came to the realization that it's just kind of doing some math on the back end, and we all use Slack, I figured, hey, why not try to make a Slack bot that does it? And what I found out was the logic is extremely easy. Getting it so that anything talks to Slack is a little more difficult. So that's what we're going to do today is we're going to cover something. And this is one of those things where we're making a tool because it's a demo and I've got 20 minutes that I'm sure there's an enterprise version of that you can pay and it'll be easy and it would be no problem. But for purposes of teaching, I'm going to take one of the most common problems we have in software development, and that is, what 5 Taylor Swift songs am I going to listen to now? And we're going to hit an endpoint. I've created a fake endpoint for this that will return 5 random Taylor Swift songs so that you don't have to have that mental load of figuring out which Taylor Swift songs you want to listen to right now. The important thing about this is you're going to be able to do it from scratch, deploy it live. Right now, I don't have this Lambda set up, and I'll go from 0 to this will be deployed by the end of this. A note for those of you who are signing in, I think hopefully this is getting dropped in some chat, but you can follow along if you go to github.com/Genghis/minibar. I've got some instructions. For those of you who are just starting out, there's a couple of things you're going to need to do first. So unfortunately, you may not be able to literally type along with me. You'll need to create or be a member, like an admin member of a Slack workspace. And I've got a link there for you. You'll need to create an AWS account. These are free. Lambdas, probably, if you're just doing a little Slack bot for you or even your company, probably that Lambda invocation will be free. You get like 1 million Lambda invocations for no money. You'll need to download and install Python 3. And then you'll need to install the AWS CLI. The only reason I'm not doing this one to demonstrate for you is because I could not figure out how to uninstall it. I told you all, I am not a developer. So the first thing we're going to do is create our credentials. So this in AWS is fairly easy. And I'm going to do something that I'm sure everybody here is going to freak out at me about, which is I am going to create credentials live. I'm going to make them visible to people as I copy and paste them in, and I'll delete them at the end of the talk. But I just want you to see how, again, from basically 0 to launch it can be. The key here is that we're going to be using a tool called Zappa instead of AWS's built-in Lambda or SAM, which is their serverless architecture management tool. We're going to use Zappa because it basically takes all of the guesswork out and makes using Python for AWS Lambdas incredibly easy and takes away having to know anything about infrastructure. So first thing we're going to do is create some credentials. I log into the AWS console. I click on my name and then my security credentials. And it takes half an hour to load. Click on access keys. I already have one here. That's for the back end of this that I already created, the endpoint. And I'll create new access key. Again, I told you I'm going to do the silly thing. I'm going to actually show you what to do here because I want to show you how easy this is. So I click show access key. You could download the key file. It's probably a good idea, but for a demo, I don't need to. I copy the access key and then I go to my console. in the console, I want to configure that AWS command line tool. And again, if you go to my GitHub page, I have the commands to start that. And I'm just going to click or type in AWS configure. It's going to ask for an access key. I'm going to paste that one in. It's going to ask for the secret key. I'm going to paste that in. Default region is good. I picked US East 2. So yes, default output format. I don't even know what that means. And now AWS should be set up. Just that easy. The next thing I want to do, and again, I'm in a folder that has some of this code that I've pre-written, so you don't have to watch me struggle bus my way through putting together Python. I'm going to create a virtual environment. The reason we create a virtual environment, again, this is fairly beginner, so some of you may roll your eyes at me, but it's so that we have a contained area that holds all of our dependencies. And it also lets Zappa do a clean grab of everything it needs in order to then throw it into space so that it can become a lambda. So it's basically a free playpen for you to use. We create that virtual environment by typing Python 3 -m venv for virtual environment, and then this folder. Takes it a second because it has to do some actual grinding behind the scenes, and then prompts me with the environment. From here, I've created an environment, and you can see that there's a couple of extra folders from the last time I did this. You'll see binary, library, include. That just means that it has what and the Python environment configuration. All that means, for as far as you're concerned, is you get to type the command that puts you into your super safe sandbox, which is typing the word source bin activate. You'll see that my prompt has changed. It's now highlighting that I am in a virtual environment called Minnebar, and it lets me get into the code. So I'm going to be bouncing back and forth to check the screen to make sure I don't have people asking questions here. Great. So when we're creating a Slack bot, I love doing these. Basically, everything I write is in Slack. Is because I don't have to write a front end. I can invoke a command. I can even add a lot of complexity. There's some really good user interface, like visual GUI stuff in Slack. But if I just want to be able to pull some data down, like I said, Jira stuff or these Taylor Swift songs, if I want to, modify how text is being displayed in Slack, if I want to check stock prices or baseball scores or something like that, hitting an API and returning that information to Slack basically means you don't have to write a front end. You don't have to deal with auth. That's all covered. So when we're working with Slack, they provide a payload that looks like this. This is their demo payload from their screen, so I don't cite it. It sends a post command, an HTTP post command with a token, a team ID, etc. The one that we care about for this demo is this one here called response URL. This is the important thing from Slack that allows us to return some information, and we'll get into that in a second. So now that I'm in a virtual environment, if you're following along on my GitHub, you'll see I just have write your code, because I don't know what you're going to be creating. Probably you do need something that can retrieve some Taylor Swift songs for you, but if you already have your own solution, I expect you'll be writing your own Python lambda here for something else. One thing that is very, very different between Zappa, and it is in fact the reason that I wanted to give this talk, is every time you look for a lambda tutorial that isn't specifically about Zappa, you get a demo piece of code that looks like this. And this is directly from the AWS documentation. You have to define a handler. Usually handler name actually is directly called lambda handler. And then it takes in automatically, because these lambdas, when they run in AWS, are actually running as a piece of code in the infrastructure. So they're expecting to be passed two things. One is called event, and one is called context. Context is a bunch of information about infrastructure. It has, S3 and various other dependent conditions in it. Basically, I've never used it even when I'm working directly with Lambda. Event, however, tends to have the payload that you define in the API gateway. Now, I'm already getting way, way over what we're going to have to do today, because what Zappa does is it stands as a piece of middleware between this portion of writing a Lambda and actually interacting with the code inside of the Lambda. So what Zappa does is it forms a WSGI, a WSGI layer between this Lambda handler concept and the code you've written. Ultimately, what that means is you don't have to write any of your Zappa code in a way that is Lambda specific. You can write it so that it would work in Flask or Django or whatever you're doing to serve it up to receive HTTP requests. It's super powerful, and it means that you're not parsing through a bunch of really arcane AWS stuff and struggling to get your API gateway hooked up to potentially even an SNS queue and all of that, SQ, and then pushing that out. So while a skeleton of a Lambda per AWS might look like this, a skeleton of a Zappa piece of code looks something more like this. Flask is an incredibly lightweight tool that allows you to have HTTP interactions, and I use it almost exclusively because I'm generally passing an HTTP GET or an HTTP POST to my Slack bots. Walking you through this skeleton, this would actually run. This would just be an actual piece of code that could run as a Lambda right now if we wanted to deploy, but we'll get a little bit more cheeky about it. So Flask, we want to have both the ability to set up a Flask server, which is the thing that'll just allow us to make requests against it, and then also part of their subpackage called request. Now, I make a comment, if you're, again, following along on GitHub and you look at taylorswift.py, that we are in a bureaucratic nightmare and a Kafkaesque hell, because I will be using Flask's request, but I will also be using an entire package called requests, plural. There's no getting around it. It's extremely annoying, and you will have a debugging issue of request versus requests at some point when you start doing this very often. But for Flask, all I need to do in order to stand up something which will serve HTTP requests is to declare that Flask and then name, so this file, basically this dunder name, dunder means here, this file is called app. And then I use a decorator in order to tell Flask what route to react to. So in this case, if somebody hits a URL at the base with a post, it'll run parse command. In this case, again, because we're only looking at this payload from Slack, I only care about setting the response URL, and then this will return the response URL. Again, incredibly lightweight, but this is a little bit broader, but more the equivalent of that general AWS Lambda tutorial kind of thing that you'll see. So I'm going to check to make sure there's no questions here. Great. I don't know what there would be questions about. So for our Lambda, just to explain what we're doing here, I'm going to, as I mentioned, I use requests, which is a library that allows you to make incredibly easy HTTP calls from Python. There's urllib3 or library 3, which is often used. Requests actually just makes a sort of a better interface as a developer on that. I'm importing JSON, which is one of the standard libraries for Python. And then I'm importing Zappa asynchronous task, and then again, the Flask stuff. So Zappa, as I mentioned, is a way of packaging up lambdas that does a lot of the hard work for you and lets you treat them like any other WSGI application. Zappa also gives us the power, because it knows all the details about our AWS infrastructure, to have an asynchronous task. And this is incredibly important for Slack apps specifically. For Slack, you have to reply within 3 seconds to their first request, or else it bottoms out. It says there's a timeout, that's not stood up. If you're just returning like something from the code itself, generally that's no problem. But for those of you who've had even a little bit of exposure to serverless Python or serverless work in general, cold starts can be a pain in the ass. So what a cold start means is when you set up a Lambda, it's being developed. Basically, it's saying this code doesn't exist. It's not on a server. Something invokes it, install, spin up, and stand up that code, run something, and when it's finished, pull it down. That's how Lambdas are working. So it can take up to 5-6 seconds for certain Lambdas to get stood up, and that's called a cold start. That cold start means that sometimes Slack just says, nah, you're not up, you don't exist, we didn't get a response. What Zappa does is it has a way of keeping warm your Lambdas so that ideally every 4 minutes they're getting hit with something, which means that it's very unlikely that any invocation of your Lambda is the first invocation. So it's hot, it already exists, it's sitting out in space, and any request to it generally gets answered immediately. However, most important and cool stuff you can do with Lambda has to happen via queries and stuff that are reaching out beyond the Lambda itself. And so things may take a long time. So in this case, we use an asynchronous task. In the command I have, I'm getting that response URL that I mentioned, and I'm passing it to this function called fetch songs. And then I am immediately returning something to Slack, giving it 200, and then running this data through. Basically, what it's doing is it's saying, hey, go spin up another Lambda to go do this work. In here, it's hitting this fake endpoint that I've created, doing some JSON magic and configuring it to look like something on Slack, and then posting that response back to a response URL. That's it. This is an entire app that will allow us to get those 5 Taylor Swift songs. So per the rest of what I have in the GitHub repo, I just need to install all my dependencies now. So I pip3 install Zappa. And while that's installing, what I'm going to do is quickly show you how to create your Slack app itself. So if you just go to api.slack.com/apps, click create an app. App name will be SwiftMother. And I will set it to my minibar demo and create the app. From here, I'm going to tell it to do a slash command. Slash command is the easiest interaction in Slack. It just allows you to type a thing and then it returns a thing. Please load. So I click create a new command. I'll type, let's just type Swift. And then I'm going to hold this here because we're about to get some information. Of course, it hangs now. It wouldn't be minibar if you didn't have to stare at a screen. I apologize. Well, what I will walk through while we're waiting is installing how to set up a fake Flask server in order to test what you're doing. So if I go into this other minibar Lambda that I had done initially in order to test this out, I can open up this virtual environment, set my Flask app to testing.py, which is some code that I've put together. that instead of sending back to Slack, just prints what I'm giving it. I can set up Flask to run, and it'll just, oop. Now let's see if this worked out. Great, it did. So if now I'm getting errors. I apologize. This is why people tell you not to do live code. And pick 3 install Flask. Oh, it's because I don't have testing in here. I see. All right, well, we can do it on this side because I know it's here. So now I have Flask running. This is, again, representing that sort of server that's floating in space there. I can throw a command at my locally running Flask server. And this is how you would test to make sure make sure your code works. Now I've set up the endpoint to wait 5 seconds because I want to represent a query that would go too long for Slack. So it tells me it's fetching songs because that's the response I'm supposed to get. And you'll see it has now printed the response that I've gotten from my endpoint. So that's great. I now know that it works. All I need to do now is make Zappa happen. This is where all of the magic happens. I'm in my folder, I'm in my virtual environment. I type the word Zappa init. It wants to know what my environment's called. I say prod. Everything else, I basically hit enter through. Here's my default. So my default is taylorswift.app. So let's do that one. Do I want it to deploy this globally? No, that's the default. And then I hit enter. Again, I want to show you that you can basically hit enter through almost all of this. Now that I've initiated Zappa, all I need to do is click or type Zappa deploy prod. This will take a little bit of time. What this is doing is it's packaging up our virtual environment with some Zappa magic, that middleware, posting it or zipping it up, uploading it to AWS, and then configuring API gateway, which you've probably heard about but maybe been intimidated by, as well as any of the other infrastructure work necessary for Lambda. So as this uploads, it's going to finish up pretty quickly here. It's going to set that keep warm callback. You'll see it actually just popped up on my screen every 4 minutes. That means that, again, it's very, very, very unlikely that this will ever die, and you'll have to deal with a cold start. As it sets up the API gateway, it now gives me a URL. This URL is that slash that you've seen here. So it's the app route that I can post against. When I go back to Slack, I make that my request URL. My short description is get some songs. And I save it. The last thing I have to do after having configured that is click install app. Install app to workspace. There's very few permissions here, which is great. There's nothing you need to do. I'm going to allow it to perform actions. There's details here that you don't need to know about. So if I now go into that workspace and type Swift, when I hit enter, it's going to give me the fetching songs message, wait 5 seconds because it's got to hit that endpoint and get the response, and give me 5 more Taylor Swift songs. So there you have it. If you follow those instructions, you can find in less than 25 minutes yourself with a fully functioning Lambda without ever needing to go into the console to configure API gateway or learn CloudFormation or anything like that. If there's questions in the 1 minute, I can take them. If not, you can hit me up on Twitter. I do have some details in the notes about what some of the code in this GitHub does and what else you can use. For a note, If you need other options, like you need to be able to deploy this behind special environments, there is a package called AWS GI that allows you a little more control than Zappa just doing its magic. And if you need a mock Lambda and not just Flask Zappa apps, the Modo library allows you to do that incredibly easy with just some decorators in your code. I believe that's my time. Thanks for dealing with a little bit of my struggle there. And hopefully you've learned a little something about how to get some serverless stuff deployed without having to learn anything about CloudFormation or AWS infrastructure. Thanks.